versus what has been our current president's priority?
Well, Frederick Douglass, I believe, said education is the key to freedom, and it starts with educating not only our children, but their parents. We have a certain responsibility to be informed. This is the greatest country in the world, the freest country in the world, with one of the lowest voter participation rates in the world. And you look at we take for granted the blood that was shed for all of us in this room to have that opportunity. Yet we go through life every day just flippantly, not really paying attention to what affects our lives every day, particularly in the African American community. It is a travesty what has been allowed to take place in our urban city centers. Detroit, and Brandon made a good point. You look at all of our urban centers, who are they controlled by? Detroit, New York, LA. New York, you could use Charlie Rangel. Look at the congressional districts.
Right.
The congressional Black Caucus members, bless their hearts, but their unemployment numbers and what's going on in those districts, it's abysmal. So we need to educate ourselves and open that up, and then economic empowerment, economic freedom is the next level. For us, as a conservative, it's important for me to hammer home that individual accomplishment should be rewarded in this country, not punished. And unfortunately, this president is engaging in a class warfare strategy here that works because it's emotional. The haves and the have-nots, when you have an economic downturn like this, it starts to make people, you start to become envious and jealous of your neighbor, as opposed to what can I do to better myself and my neighbors? And he's not allowing us to do that. The stimulus money, throwing more government in and just taking taxpayer money. My congressman, he jokes all the time when you have kids come and visit. He goes, "We're going to go take a tour of the West Capitol and I'll show you the money tree." The kids go, "Wait, what?" No, there's no money tree in Washington, D.C. It's all of us, it's taxpayers. And that money should be going into private investment, not expanding the government. For example, $885 million from the stimulus was invested in Washington, D.C. They cannot account for how many jobs that actually created. That's almost $1 billion just in Washington, D.C. alone. That's supposed to be a stimulus, yet they cannot account for how many jobs it actually created. That's a problem. Now imagine what $885 million could do in the private sector, reinvested back into communities and empowerment zones and enterprise zones. It would create tens of thousands of jobs, and it would be better run, and actually somebody would be able to account for it. So we need to think about what role government do we actually want. Do we think that the government has worked? Take a look around. Public housing, welfare, has it worked in the community? I don't think so. It's been a market for failure. Versus when you have private sector come in and you see how neighborhoods flourish, they have good schools, home ownership, business owners, creating jobs.
So that's the dichotomy. That's the decision we're trying to grapple with today. The role of government, the size of government, how government in the 60s under President Johnson, Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, having a floor for people who are at the bottom rung of the ladder. How do we move people up to the middle class? How do we move and empower people with opportunities to grow and to expand? And we look at education, for example, and we look at the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and in Harlem, for example, we have a big debate going on right now between charter schools and regular schools. And there are marked differences in terms of student outcomes and performance. So a big Republican point is the expansion of the charter schools, something that works, or something that we know is having better results, over a system where, if your school, doesn't get the money, or the teachers aren't prepped right, well, you're going to be in that cycle of that same school. Like, why would we, as a community, vote and continue to empower people on our behalf who hold that viewpoint?
There's a young lady. Did you have a question?
I'm sorry. I know this isn't a time for a question, but I was just kind of taken aback by the gentleman's, comparison of public schools and charter schools, and kind of as someone who formerly worked in Harlem and worked for an organization that started a charter school, I don't necessarily know if we can make the argument that all charter schools are great and all public schools are bad. So it just kind of hit a core with me, and I'm just here to try to really understand a point of view. I think it's very close-minded to just kind of stay in one area. I am a Democrat, but I came here to kind of just have discourse, and so I think it's really important that as all of us are in here are lawyers, that we kind of make sure that these arguments aren't just too close, because we know, and I see the sister right here agreeing with me, that all charter schools, the outcomes are not all good for our community. There have been many that closed in Harlem. So I just wanted to make that point as a former teacher.
Just to rescue Andrew for that, I think the broader point is the option of choice. We can, within the education community, you can decide whether, are the outcomes better or not. But I think that we've seen the failure, though, overall of inner city public schools on a large scale. For the most part, are there good inner city public school systems somewhere? Sure, but we've seen, we can use Washington D.C. as another example right here next door. The graduation rate here is embarrassing, and that shouldn't be. And Washington D.C. receives more money per student per capita for the city of its size than any other city in the country. So more money isn't the answer. But when you've got, a bureaucracy and you have a school board that's not accountable, the accountability factor, and then you have the unions that are, that come in here and they overrun things. So in Washington, charter schools have been very successful, and or even school choice. We thought that it was unfortunate that the Democrat Congress voted out the opportunity scholarships for kids here in Washington to go to different schools, get them out of this cycle here. That's just a microcosm of a lot of other urban areas in this, larger cities, Chicago, New York, where the school system is it's unacceptable, and we should demand more. So I think for Andrew's point, he was being overly general. You can't do that. We're in a room of lawyers. You can't get away with that. But the concept was that there should be options. There's the choice, the parental choice.
All right, Mr. Johnson.
Well, Brandon's got something.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as somebody who is familiar with legislation, particularly education legislation, there's a couple myths that I want to demystify or Number one, charter schools are public schools. That's the first thing. Two, charter schools, not all charter schools are successful, and not all public schools are not successful. So I think if somebody who understands that, the broader issue, which even stems past Democrat and Republican, is a school working or is a school not working? Is a teacher teaching or is a teacher not performing? And so I think when we look at, there's a couple of issues. One, I know roughly in the Northeast, charters, or in certain areas, certain urban communities spend roughly $25,000 to $24,000 per pupil. And a lot of these schools, less than 60% of the students are actually graduating. In certain rural areas, they spend a quarter of that, which is about $12,000 to $13,000. And in those schools, there's higher graduation rates, 80 and 90%. There's a couple issues is that even with the unions, I know a lot of states are doing teacher tenureship, which is saying basically you've got between 3 and 4 years to prove that you are a successful teacher before you're granted tenure. On the other hand, the big thing is performance measure. And how are these teachers able to be evaluated? How do we get the politics out of that? There are still challenges with that. However, charters have proved that they have been successful. I think one of the biggest myths is, though, that every place needs a charter school. Every community does not need a charter school. Charter schools should, and originally were legislated to go towards those districts which actually were in need. And so I think what's happening is that you've got some charter schools that are not being successful, and some charter schools that are being successful. And the ones that are not being successful, those opposers to charter school, or those opposers to the charters, which are both Democrats and Republicans, are saying, well, look, this doesn't work. But I think what's happening is that we're seeing that charters and magnet schools and high-performing public schools are working, especially when it talks about black and brown education. So I think it's important that when we talk about the GOP's message on education, it's important to also say there are some Democrats who are not only supporting quality education, but looking at the bigger picture, which is saying that we have a problem in our urban school systems. And that problem is that in many cases, although there are some union memberships who are in support of quality education, some of that union leadership is not in support of quality education, especially for our black and brown students.
And just, I know he's probably not the most popular person here, but George Bush made a very good point during the debates in 2000 where he talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. However you feel about him and his presidency, that was a very poignant point to make, because if you set the bar low, if you go through life having low expectations, that's what you're going to get. And we need to look and ask ourselves in our own communities, is this acceptable? And it shouldn't be. And for us as conservatives, we want, education to be on a local level. People need to be involved. And it's hard because you've got a lot of single parent homes, people don't have time to go to PTA meetings when they're working 2 jobs to pay the rent. But there needs to be some mechanisms in place where parents have the opportunity to be involved and know what's going on in their kids' school and demand excellence. If you have low expectations, that's what you're going to get. So I think that's a concept that we should be cognizant of and think about how we change that as well as a community.
Okay, we're going to take our first Twitter question. During the course of the presidential campaign for GOP side, a lot of candidates have been making comments that some members of the African American community take offense to, belittling of workers, comments that have been made on the campaign trail. Does anyone want to address that or talk a little bit about how a lot of Black Republicans usually, or the criticism is that they're not as vocal in speaking out or speaking against when candidates sometimes make those kind of comments?
Well, yeah. I always find it rather intriguing and interesting. First of all, many of us speak out on these issues privately and publicly. A couple years ago, or last year, our organization in particular, when Sarah Palin spoke out in reference to Dr. Laura, whatever her name was, we were on MSNBC and spoke out and said that was unacceptable. When comments have been made about Michelle Obama's behind, we have spoke out and said that was unacceptable. When the pictures of President Obama has been characterized as a monkey, we have stepped out and said that's unacceptable. So to make the assumption that Black Republicans are so caught up in the Republican Party that we're not willing to speak out against the party is foolishness. Look, we speak out more times than not, but oftentimes it's not heard. And it's definitely not publicized, because it's not publicized when Republicans speak out in the first place, and when you're a Black Republican, you're a smaller group within the group. So it's not safe. But I want to make one thing clear, as was been said already. We're not here to defend the Republican Party. I'm not going to tell you the Republican Party is all that in a bag of chips and they make no mistakes, because that'd be the biggest bold-faced lie I could ever tell you. They make plenty of mistakes. As a matter of fact, one of the mistakes that they continue to make, even when it comes down to the messaging of some of the candidates, is they don't have people like you and I on their staffs to help them understand how to message.